what is, Ms. Gates, accelerated aging? Take it away.
Okay, I have a few slides just to make sure people can see it. And then hopefully people will talk, because I didn't do very many slides and I'm used to doing more than I've done here, but I know everybody likes to ask questions. So can I share my screen and I will leave it in that particular mode so I can see everybody's face, because I don't have a lot of screens up. Okay, I'm not seeing everybody's face. Sorry, I'm trying to get my screens already. Can you see my slides?
We can.
Good. So hopefully it'll be interesting to people and you won't hear too many things going on outside. We're getting some construction done in our house. And I just came back from the hospital yesterday. So talk about accelerated aging. Had some problems. So I asked the question, do you need accelerated aging on products and packaging? And I'm going to give you a spoiler alert, if I can get it to page down. No, you don't need accelerated aging. You have to have real-time aging. That is the requirement. The problem is you get into,
well, I don't know
why do you want to wait a year to put something on the market? What do you say, Joe?
I don't know what accelerated aging means. What does it mean?
Well, we'll get there. That's a way of aging your product faster than a real-time aging. So I've got a couple examples of that in a little bit. So, oops. Accelerated aging looks at your package at a later time and make sure that it actually matches up with what you started with. So at the end of the production line, you're doing a lot of tests to make sure your product works well. Your product packaging is sealed up or in place and doesn't have problems and creases and stuff to it. But how do you know that's going to be the same way in a year? And that's why you're doing accelerated aging, because you have to prove that it actually works for that whole time. And if you want 2 years of expiration date, then you need to wait 2 years. Now, how many people have 2 years to have something sitting around to make sure it works the same as original? Or do you want to get it on the market a little sooner? So I have some examples of accelerated aging and things that actually happen. I don't know how much you know about materials, but as it sits around for a long time, it starts to fall apart. And it doesn't matter if you've actually made it into clothes or other things, that material falls apart no matter what configuration you've made it in over time. Drapes are a great one. I mean, that's sun rot, but that's a type of aging that's happening to your materials. Tires, to me, were always the perfect thing to look at, because, you know, tires start falling apart and cracking whether you've used them or not. That's an accelerated aging thing. This is a laminate structure that's been sitting around for a while, and you can see it's starting to fall apart here. And here's some corrugated cases. Because of aging, they've started falling apart at the seams, so they're not going to have the strength they should have. I want to make you know that I found out something interesting on tires, that the US is about the only country in the world that will sell you a 5-year-old tire that hasn't been used. 5-year-old tires start to crack and have problems. So please check the date on your tires to make sure they're actually new tires and will last longer for you. You've seen all those shredded tires that are on the freeways every so often. It's mainly because they've aged and they've fallen apart. It's not because they've been used particularly, it's because they're old and cracking. So here's the thing I was talking about, accelerated aging. If you want to wait for 2 years at room temperature, that's 728 days. If we do accelerated aging at 45C, you only have to wait 196 days.
Jan,
or if we,
doesn't the material make a difference if I'm talking about tire versus pudding? I mean, help us.
Yes, we're getting there. It's if you get to accelerated aging, thank you. It's a study of all these properties and stuff. And they have a really good ASTM standard that tells you how to do it. Because with accelerated aging, as we show here, it's based on chemical reactions that are going on in your product. So you've got to have an idea of what rate the materials degrade at. So pudding's going to degrade faster than a tire or whatever else you're looking at because of the chemical reactions that go on inside of it. We're going to use an Arrhenius reaction rate function that talks about no change at higher temperatures. So in general, it's a 10-degree increase in temperature will increase the rate of how you're aging your product. But you have to make sure you don't go so hot that you're having chemical changes instead of just an aging change. And that's hard to do. Luckily, we have some FDA guidance on it, and it's in this particular standard and also in the USP. I'm not sure which section in USP. It used to be in 1075, but I don't know if they've renumbered it. Wendy, do you know? Because you used to do that.
Wendy, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I was trying to find the button. That's probably still an accurate chapter, 1079, because that's a general packaging chapter, but I think it just references the Arrhenius equation just like that also.
So it looks complicated, but it's not that bad of an equation. I've been able to put it into Excel so I can try and figure out what you're doing. So it's sort of like, Joe, if you get hot over time, you run out sooner, your skin starts drying out and other things. If you get to a really hot temperature, you're going to die because you've got chemical reactions going on that make your insides cook and you don't work. But if you're at a lower temperature, you just get hot and sort of dry it out. So that's not a great example, but it sort of tells you why you're looking at the temperatures to make sure that it all works right for you. So when you get in there, you do have some caveats you have to worry about for accelerated aging, because you have to do real-time aging too, because there are things that can happen in accelerated aging that won't happen in real-time aging. So you're confirming that your accelerated aging actually matches up with your real-time aging. So as you're going on, if you've got a 2-year accelerated aging, that's only going to be the 100 and some odd days I was talking about before instead of 2 years real-time. You just need to start them within 3 months of each other and look to see that you don't have a problem. Because I've had a problem with accelerated aging where we cooked the pouch just high enough that it released some agents into the package and caused the product to fail. But our real-time aging at the time level or at the temperature level that we needed to do didn't show that and wasn't a problem. So you have to start them. And I look at that. If a lot of people try and use 60°C because you can cook it faster and get some results, but that's usually the temperature that causes the product to have chemical reactions to just start falling apart and having problems that aren't real in real time. The highest safest temperature that I've been able to use is 55°C. And the best temperature is actually 40°C. Especially if you have pressure sensitive labels that you have to age for some reason, the adhesive goes bad on that label. And then you got to know what temperature your product is going to be used at. If it's really nice if you've got a 2 to 8 degree product, 2 to 8 degrees C product, because when you accelerated age it at room time temperature, it goes really fast and you don't have to wait hardly any days at all. I mean, it's just a few months for a year or two. And I've got some of those things out there. Is anybody following this so far? Is it making sense to people? Good. And then what is room temperature to you? I had a couple things down here. It's not showing. If you're shipping in like parts of Africa or parts of the EU, they actually have a room temperature that's closer to 28 28°C, which is really too hot for us. That's over 80 degrees. But we generally run in the 23 to 25°C range. Then you have to know about your Q10. That's part of the equation. If we don't know what it is, the FDA says we can use 2 now, which is really helpful. They used to tell you you had to use a lower temperature or lower Q10, which made your time blossom out more, but they're accepting 2 now. I only know of PETG has an 8 Q10 or a 10. And you just need to see if your manufacturer of the material actually knows what the Q10 rate is. And if they don't, use it too. And then what degradation is acceptable? Usually it's none, but sometimes you have tests and you know when your product or packaging is aging and showing changes, but they're not going to have a functional problem for you when you give it to a customer. And usually that means you need well, in all cases, you need to know what a T = 0 or a 0 time test result is. And that's just off the manufacturing line with all your acceptability tests to show that everything looks fine. Humidity is not part of accelerated aging, but you might want to consider it. But then you go into things about water vapor, and that's a whole different thing to talk about. They've got a little bit of that information in that ASTM test, so you can make sure you use the right actual humidity level. Because I have found things like 25C if I'm having as room temperature and I want to go to an accelerated aging of 50C or something, and the humidity at our 25C is considered 80%. But when you move it up to 50, 55C, you're only talking about a 20% humidity, because you need to worry about your water vapor, not just the relative humidity. That's a whole nother talk, trying to explain that better. And then how do you calculate your expiration date? I know in Europe, if you say it's 2 months, or 6 months, you've got to say 6 months plus 1 month because of the way the dating is on your expiration. So you have to make sure you include that when you're looking at your accelerated aging. And then if you are shipping something that's considered hazardous, you also have to do some UN testing where it's applicable. And that's not the same as the performance test that we usually do to make sure a product in a package is acceptable, because these guys, the UN, is only worried about the hazardous material leaking out of your package and making somebody sick. They don't care if it's actually functional or not. They just make sure it's not leaking. So you have to do a different set of performance tests with your aging and everything else that's going on to make sure that everything functions properly. And then make sure you understand your risk assessment, because if it doesn't really matter if a product cracks or something, you need to account for that when you're doing your testing and put that in there as an acceptable thing to happen. And then you've got your time points for testing. And this depends on your shelf life and what your risk assessment is. You always need your starting point, which is called 0 time or T. And then if you're sterilizing, you've got to have that in there unless you've proven that sterilization doesn't affect your materials. And then usually a lot of people will test every 6 months just to make time points that equal 6 months, just to make sure that the product works right. Because if you get a failure, and that's what I was a little worried about what Sue had, because she's doing 1 and 3 year. So if it fails at 3 years, she can only do 1 year of shelf life dating. And that means that it could have been okay at 2 years, but she's not going to know because she didn't test it. So you have to see what you can afford and what makes sense for your product based on your risk assessment to make sure that you can get an expiration date as long as you possibly want.
I'm a little confused. In the opening moments of your presentation, you said, spoiler alert, is you do not need accelerated aging. And then you said, but who among us has 2 years for product to just sit around and make sure it's going to be okay? So how do you reconcile those two very disparate statements?
With the accelerated aging that I was talking about.
Yes.
So you will have like 2 years going on, which is 728 days. But if you accelerated age, you might be able to prove depending upon the temperature you're doing,
Right,
that you can actually do to have a 2-year product in 196 days
yes.
instead of 728.
So your premise in the opening slide was you don't need it, but then you have to wait for 2 years, and that's why you use it.
Yes.
Ultimately, time progresses, and in 2 years, you should also look at what naturally aged.
Mhm.
Yes? Okay. I didn't miss the point then.
Yeah, because that's the only way you can prove that you've actually accounted for everything that could be happening to that product over time. Because there's a lot of work showing that people shouldn't accelerate age, or other work that says accelerated aging is fine, and it depends upon your material.
Sue, you said you're working with Nelson Labs right now, and you have 3 time periods that you're aging for.
Yes.
Yeah.
4, yeah, really. Because
And-
we are doing real-time aging as well.
Is temperature the main variant?
I think so, but I don't know definitively.
It's supposed to be.
Mhm.
So I would assume they would. That's
Yeah.
temperature is the only variant, because they really prefer you having the same lot of material doing real time as the accelerated.
But Nelson Lab isn't doing the accelerated aging. We're waiting on parts for them for something else. Accelerated agings. We went to ISO sterilization, and now we're in the accelerated aging stage.
Is your main material glass or plastic?
Plastic.
You could probably accelerate age glass at a higher temperature than you can plastic, because generally glass will handle a higher temperature without cracking and falling apart and having problems.
Heather?
But if you got labels on your bottle, or you're putting it into a paperboard carton with some kind of labeling and inking and stuff, you probably want to do the same kind of temperature you might want to do for plastic, just to make sure your cartons don't fall apart, ink doesn't smear, labels don't fall off, and that kind of stuff. So that's where you have to look at your risk assessment and see what's important to you, because you're supposed to be doing your work based on your risk assessment.
Kevin?
I just had a question as far as, what it's acceptable to actually test. I mean, can you test based on prototypes, or do you have to get like manufacturing batches?
If you can prove your prototype is going to be basically the same, and I say basically all the same materials, you're handling it the same way, you can use prototype stuff.
Okay.
But you have, we do that a lot with packaging. With product, they'd like you to have exactly as long as it's the same material, handled the same way, the prototypes are okay to age, to prove that things are working well. Now, if you're in pharmaceuticals, that's different, but
That's why I was asking, because I know from the pharma side, you've got basically, minimum batch size that you can use for validation compared to what your, full production batch size is. That's why I wanted to ask.
Yeah, when we get into validations, that's got to be manufacturing stuff, but aging is a little bit different than the machine validations that in packaging.
No. I mean, even from like QC validation on pharma, when you look at long-term stability on, say, an API or excipient, you still need, there's a minimum batch size compared to what your full validated production is going to be.
Yeah, it's because when I look at the regulations, pharmaceuticals had a whole bunch of problem having manufacturing right with their product.
Yeah.
Where medical devices just had more problems with the actual design originally. So the regulations are written different for what you need to look at with medical devices and pharmaceutical. Pharmaceuticals usually does millions of stuff, millions of products set out. In the medical device size, it's not unusual to maybe make 1,000 products a year. That's it. So you don't have that same kind of restrictions on it.
My other question, which you might get to somewhere else in here, is how, other things, like sterilization methods, kind of may affect these aging studies.
Well, that's why when you're doing the aging studies, you need to have the sterilization method you're going to use for your product. You could have some engineering tests to look at what's happening to the product in a smaller scale with different kinds of sterilization processes if you want to. But it wouldn't be considered what would be put on the expiration date at that point in time until you finish those studies.
Yeah, and then also obviously, like with everything going on right now with ETO and the push to kind of replace ETO, a lot of people are going to have to go back and kind of redo their studies, right? If they change methods.
Yeah, if they change methods, they have to redo their studies, basically everything, to make sure it functions the same way. The FDA is allowing differences in how they do the submissions for sterilization of different products, but you still need to do those tests. Somebody was going to say something.
I think, Joe, that's actually, if you can find somebody to do an update on sterilization along the way, I think that's a whole subject in and of itself right now.
Yes.
I've spoken a few times on it. I can find you those recordings, and unless there's something particularly contemporary.
Jan, I haven't been paying that close attention in the last few months, but have there not been new things put out fairly recently by FDA on this? I think there's a relatively new guidance, right?
And they have a new testing thing that they're trying to do with sterilization, but I haven't looked into that too much. I did put a new sterilization method that I learned about a couple months ago into my packaging channel for here, and it's just a whole new way of doing it, and the FDA has just approved it, and it looks too good to be true, and I'm really trying to find some people that are using it, because you batch it up and you just ship it and it sterilizes on the way, and then it all dissipates and it's done at room temperature. So it's really good for electronics. So that would be a fun one to do.
I put a link in the chat for everyone. It'll take you to premium. For those of you who are full members, you'll have access to that.
Thanks, Joe.
Wendy?
Yep. So I just wanted to add a couple comments. And Kevin, you kind of beat me to the punch talking about the sterilization there. So when you asked Joe if it's about material and temperature, I wanted to make sure that we also make sure we consider sterilization too, right? Because that's going to affect the materials before you start your aging process. So unfortunately, in my experience doing these studies, we literally at Nelson had a client that overexposed their packaging to gamma sterilization, and we did the accelerated aging at the conservative temperatures, and at the end of 5 years it literally had disintegrated into nothing. There was no packaging left. So you also have to consider that in your risk assessment. And then Kevin, to your point about the EPA requirements that are coming on, there isn't a drive to switch modalities. It's more about reducing the gas exposure concentration. So currently we're working on revalidating all of the product lines to less than 400. So there's no consideration for switching modalities. We're just dropping the concentration. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, if you can get a plant that isn't getting shut down by the EPA, that's the way to go. And that's what I was saying. There was caveats, and if you're sterilizing, I think it's here. If you're sterilizing, you have to sterilize too. I guess it was in someplace else, but yes, you have to sterilize before you start accelerated aging because of the things that can happen to your materials. And that's one thing that's really nice on this ASTM standard that I had. Where'd it go? On the F1980, it's actually been retitled for medical devices and the packaging itself, which is really nice. It's a general accelerated aging thing, and it should work on anything. And I have used it for products before I've actually, and non-sterile products before it was actually retitled. The
I know you're huge Jan acolyte. What have you got to contribute today?
I missed the first part of what you were saying.
I was saying that Rick is a huge Jan Gates
Oh.
acolyte. And he has something to contribute.
Oh, actually, I've got a question. So I've been involved in projects that had accelerated aging. In one instance, the accelerated aging was so extreme that it actually melted some of the internal components. But we did a great job on designing it, so it still worked. But my question is this: there's always the question of how well the accelerated aging represents actual true aging, and I'm wondering, is there a number for it or a factor or something like that? In other words, if we do some scheme of accelerated aging and we would say we're 90% sure that this is going to represent 2 years in storage at whatever, is there a degree of certainty that is used to rate different accelerating aging protocols?
How well does accelerated aging mirror real aging historically?
It
correlated?
depends upon your materials, and that's why you have to do real time at the same time, because you might have picked the wrong temperature.
I've seen that.
And yeah, and what
Yeah.
we've done, especially when I'm working with class 3 devices, we look at every single material in the product and the packaging and do our research on what temperatures might affect that. And if we don't know, that's when we do some engineering tests and look at different temperatures and what it's doing to the package itself.
Yeah. I would actually have a picture of one of those items, probably if this had been in the days when we had smartphones, but oh my goodness, it was incredible opening it up.
Yeah,
We
having
literally had singed components and the device still worked. All 3 circuit boards, all 5 support members. It was incredible. But my customers are more likely to ask me, how certain is a given type of accelerated aging? How certain are we that it's going to mirror the actual aging? And I know there's a lot of qualifications about it, but it sure sounds like you probably would have done a better job at doing your initial material research than this instance that I referred to. But
well, I know when I was working with pacemakers and I found out how fast batteries discharge with high temperatures, I got a little concerned. Then I found out my package actually started melting before it hit the temperature that affected the product. So I could say if my packages looked melted or we had a double barrier, and if it's stuck together, don't use the product, period. And
Yeah.
that worked out really good. So we had temperature control through the packaging. So that's why you have a risk assessment too, to look at different pieces. And that's why you have to do your material research before you actually start doing your accelerated aging. But like I said, if you look at those temperatures, where did I have temperatures? Where I said it's best to assume 60 C is bad, don't use it. You might get away with 55 C, but 40 is usually the more conservative number to be using for your accelerated aging temperatures. And I had my caveats. Oh, one thing that's really nice. Oh, you're not supposed to have to do performance testing and aging tests together, but because there's a lot of distrust on you knowing all your degradation factors and testing, they make you do performance testing. Performance testing is actually like shipping studies to make sure that the shock and vibration doesn't affect your product. The best news, at least for packaging, is once you do your aging tests and get them all done, you never have to do it again, as long as the product's not interacting with the materials and you don't change your manufacturing processes and your material suppliers. So that's nice. So once you do it, you don't have to do it again. There are some references that I put in here on why you want to do it. The CFR requires it. And then there's the 11607 if you're doing terminally sterilized medical devices. And I'm telling you right now, if you have a non-sterile medical device, there is a new ISO standard being written that will basically follow this 11607 and just take out the sterilization part. So if you want to get ahead of the game, you might want to understand that. So this is where I was trying to show some aging examples at different temperatures. So different temperatures are accelerated aging on the left. And then here is where you're trying to do your different times. And I said, usually you have a Q10 of 2. But if you're using those clear trays like PET, one of them has a Q10 of 8, and you can see what happens to the product as you age it. That's one of the reasons if you're using something over 40C with PETG in it, you can see the difference in what that aging is, and your tray might break apart before you actually get to the right ages and other things that you're doing. So sometimes you look at them at different time periods just to make sure that everything works right. So Rick, this is part of the problem that was going on, that they didn't look at the material well enough to understand the Q10s. I've had, so you can see for 3 years, if we go to, do I have that 3 years right? Anyway, there's, yeah, 3 years. If we go to 3 years for 97 days and your Q10 is 8 or even 5 or something else, you've got a lot more than 3 years going on with that product. I did one product once where we were trying to go to 3 years with PET, and it ended up our PET trays were actually something like 23 years old instead of the 3 years we were trying for the product. So it fractured and had problems, and it started ripping apart our pouch that we had it in. And we had to, that's where we didn't do our calculations quite right. And we had failed the test and had to go and do some other tests to prove that the aging was okay with that product. Then I just recently had a client that actually had batteries in their product, and I was trying to tell them that there's a discharge that goes on with batteries just sitting on the shelf. And they were trying to decide what shelf life they wanted for their product by the accelerated aging. And I'm going, well, we need to know what temperatures you want to age at and how long you think it's going to last, because they want to get it done as soon as possible and do this 55C. Well, look what happens right at 3 years, and they were hoping for 5 years. I don't have any battery charge left to prove that the product works good or not if I'm aging at 55C. So you have to make sure that your product itself doesn't have an issue or have discharge things if you've got batteries in there. And then if you start adding temperature on there, humidity on there, and you got a lithium ion that leaks or something, you could catch fire when you're trying to do this work because of the way those batteries operate. So you've got to sit down and look at these things to make sure that everything's working right for you. So I was talking about some of the temperature conversions, because I know sometimes I have problems going between centigrade and Fahrenheit. And I try to give some comments on it, because we used to use 20C for room temperature, which really sped up our aging. FDA got smart on that and said that's too cold. That is not room temperature. They want us to use 25. They'll let us get away with 23 if you're in a hospital or doing something like that, but they want you to use 25C. Well, I've also worked with some other places where they want to consider it at 86 degrees Fahrenheit or 30C rather than 25, which really slows down your aging. So you have to sort of get an idea of what temperature you're going to be holding your product at so you can do your aging properly. So there's a lot of work to do ahead of time. That's where I try and do mapping, so I understand exactly where the product's going to be and for how long and at what temperatures, what humidities, so that we can actually set up these aging tests properly. And that's about all I had for slides, and I wanted more questions.
Oh,
Is
there's
it
plenty.
totally
Some people-
confusing to people or?
some folks have been passing notes in the chat here. Dr. Carr is famous for typing instead of raising her hand. I'm calling her out, and you can stand up, Sue, in front of the class, and you can tell everyone what's on your mind.
We're using E-beam sterilization. Do you have any experience with that, Jen?
Oh, yeah. What do you want to know? The problem I always have with e-beam is some people or some facilities e-beam from the top or top and bottom or on the side. So you have to set up your product properly so it goes through. It's on a conveyor, so it's shaking. So you got to make sure your product isn't moving around so it sterilizes better. You've got to set it up so you don't get shadowing. And then you've got to get it through there because it's a type of radiation. So it could affect your materials.
Hey, Jan, can I throw something in real fast? Because I'm gonna have to break off our meeting on E-beam. It's fairly new. They haven't gotten all their validations down for drugs and medical devices and boxes and stacks and packages and stuff like that. So you have to be really careful who you're working with, because sometimes you have to start a validation to see if E-beam will work. And then you have your configurations that you have to put together, and it's got to be the same every single time. Otherwise, your 10 to the -6 kill probably won't work in a lot of kind. We sent drugs in. We noticed that there were some drugs that can't be E-beam sterilized. So you got to be real careful about E-beam, because it's not the same as gamma radiation, which just kills everything. And it's just strong as hell. E-beam's a little bit lighter, it's a little more delicate, and not all the validations have been put in yet. So you may have to run a validation first just to see if E-beam can be worked.
Yeah, you have to do a sterilization validation before you start doing these aging tests and stuff to make sure everything's killed everywhere it needs to be killed.
That's what we're doing now. I know that we can't use, what is it, ethanol? We can't go down that path.
Ethanol?
Ethyl, the chemical, we can't, that's gonna disintegrate some of our material.
The ETO or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, ETO. Yeah, and that's the thing. Sometimes radiation will break down to plastic. It becomes hydrochloric acid. Other times the ETO is too hot because they use steam when they inject the EO in there to sterilize things. And then you've got to do what they call washes, which is putting it under vacuum and pumping it back and forth. And that's just a little bit much for some products. That's why this new one that's done at room temperature, and it's using a chemical that's supposedly in your body to start with. So you don't have to worry about residuals or the heat from the E-beam or the radiation changes to materials. It just doesn't happen because it's at room temperature. That's why it looks exciting to me, but too good to be true. So I really want to see it being used somewhere.
When you have your hand raised, Mark, you had typed the question, what performance testing is required? And you list shock, fall, tumbling, vibration.
Shock
Testing for what?
in performance testing.
Yes.
You're checking to see if you are putting things through shipping, whether it's going to scratch, break, puff things apart, because when it goes over or up in an airplane or over the continental divide, the pressure changes and it can expand your packages. And that's happened in E-beam with, you've got a sealed package, the air puffs up enough that it can actually break your cases and stuff. So with performance testing, it's shock and vibration basically, which means handling for dropping, putting it on a truck and having it shake apart, different things like that. Is that what you were asking about?
Yes,
Even,
that's what I was asking about.
yeah, even fork trucks or clamp trucks, you're looking to see. That's why you got to map and see how your product's going to be handled and make sure you do your testing that matches. That's one of the reasons I like ASTM D4169, because there's what 13, 18, there's a whole bunch of different things to pick from that we've studied to make sure the product is being tested the way it's being handled out there at an accelerated pace. Is that useful?
Yes, that's what I was interested in, to know what are the processes and what is necessary, what's required.
Well, those are those tests, but then you've got to do the other thing if you're doing a validation where you've got to have everybody trained, you've got to make sure your equipment is calibrated and working well, you've got to document all that stuff, and it ends up being a big old report when you've just done a shake, rattle, and roll. And then you've got to do your the aging tests and see. Now, do you do aging tests before or after performance testing? It depends upon what your product's doing out there in the field. Usually people do it before aging tests, but not always, because sometimes it's sitting on a shelf and then it's going to be shipped, and that's when you really want to do performance testing after you've done aging or something like that. We're going to get away from that. We're really trying hard in the packaging community to come up with good tests to understand degradation, so you don't have to do some of this performance testing afterwards that some of the auditors are demanding. Some of the auditors. So it depends on who you have.
Wendy.
Hi, so Jan, I'm interested to learn more about this new method that you were talking about, because I know that ethylene oxide is exhaled by the body, so I'm assuming it's not that. Would you be willing, even if it's separate from today's webinar, would you be willing to share that information so that I can
sure. It was
look
at
at
Pack Out. It was at Pack Out, and the people that invented the process were actually there, and they'd probably love to talk here on the MDG just to get people to understand what's going on. And I can ask them, Joe, if you'd like that too. And it's in that there was an article in the
on this would be worthwhile. I'm certainly happy to make this room available for it. Folks, would that be incremental for you, or maybe just a few folks? Okay, I see a couple of thumbs up. So
Yeah, that'd be neat.
So Jan, I didn't go to Pack Out, so can you connect us that way too? Thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and it's the article that was written up in Health Pack is I put into Joe's my packaging line there on the premium channel. Are you part of the premium?
Not yet, she's not.
Ah, okay.
Go
Wendy,
ahead.
I don't have your new email, so.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. It was very informative. Just sharing the experience I had with FDA class 2 device, medical device, electronics involved. We were given 6 months without aging test to put expiry date on the product as an investigational product. But once we done the accelerated aging, they ask us to do full functional test for sterility and full functional test for the device itself. That included leaks, make sure the sterility is maintained, seal is maintained, stuff like that. So just sharing the experience that I had.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. Some auditors demand that, and even though you're not supposed to have to. And so it's just easier to do performance testing after aging. Now, if you've got a terminally sterilized medical device, you don't have to do validation again on your sterility, as long as we have made sure there's no holes in the package. That's one thing that's nice about the other. So
yeah, it's not sterilization, it's the sterility. You send your samples back in the lab and you make sure it's still sterile. It's not,
well, and that's why I'm saying you can make sure it's still sterile, but why do that if you have no holes in your package? So there is a guidance document that talks about that by the FDA, that you do not have to redo your sterilization as long as we don't put holes in the package. So I can put that, it's FDA guidance documents are free. So I could put that in the packaging channel if that would be helpful for you because I was really upset that they spent 15 years before publishing that particular guidance document. I don't know why, but it's sort of nice to have around because it really saves you a lot without having to do that sterility testing again.
And you're a fan favorite. I'm reading quickly as we close. Awesome presentation, great explanations. Thanks, informative, and always enlightening. Wonderful.
It's fun with packaging. That's why I've been doing it a while and finding out different things and trying to help people where I can.
Next week, Billy Haynes will come off mute and show himself and tell us about his product, what he's working on in the sleep area. And we could use your functional expertise, everyone, to help him fill in any gaps he may have and help him get to market even faster. And I think that we may see him in April next year. New place, we're not going to be in San Diego, just a little north in Newport Beach at a new facility. So I hope folks like that idea. This is Joe Hage for Joe Hage Enterprises, wishing you a happy weekend and thanks for joining and being a highlight of the week. Bye, everyone. See you online.